Hello and welcome to week 3 of the class and unit 3 of the textbook, or at least the first half of unit 3 of the textbook. Before we jump into this week's material, I just wanted to say that after reading through the papers from week 2, that it seems like most of you are demonstrating a really thorough understanding of the material thus far, which is wonderful to see. A lot of you are also doing a great job with the Turabian formatting. Some others aren't quite getting the hang of it yet. If you feel that you're not quite understanding the formatting yet, or if my comments on the papers that have been returned to you have some suggestions on ways to just improve your formatting style a little bit, please take my advice, read page 171 of the Turabian Writer's Manual, rewatch that Intro to Turabian video I posted in week 2, and as always, email me any questions about the style you have. You can even send me your paper as long as you send it a day or two in advance, and I'd be happy to go through and just point out any improvements you can make. My goal is for you to not only gain the mastery of this writing style, but of course get the best grade as possible in the class. So please keep that in mind for your week 4 papers. This week though, it's just a discussion board. So let's jump into the material. This week we will be talking about the late Baroque period. We did some early Baroque last week, now we're doing late Baroque. So Baroque refers to the year 1600 to 1750. Now, one thing I want to open up with that's significant is the year 1750. Why do we say that Baroque music ended then? Because really it wasn't a black and white end to a genre. Music has always evolved gradually over time, and there are moments when music begins to develop faster or slower, but it's always gradual. It's not like someone woke up on January 1st, 1750 or 1751 and said that today we're going to write music differently, we're going to play music differently. That's not what happened. What happened was that's the year that Johann Sebastian Bach died. Bach came to epitomize the Baroque style. He's going to be one of the 3 most important composers we speak about in this class, in addition to Mozart and Beethoven. So Johann in German, the J has a Y sound. That's actually pretty common for many languages. Sebastian, like the crab. And we have Bach with a Ch sound in there, which is common in many languages, especially in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. We don't have that sound in American English, but Ch. So a lot of people say Bach. That's not right, though no one will probably give you too hard of a time, but it is Bach is the appropriate way to pronounce his name. So Bach died, and he was so influential to this style that after he passed, music scholars said we can't continue to call music Baroque style. The most important figure has passed, and we're going to close that chapter with him. And imagine if we did that with someone who was an important music producer or musician today. Someone like, if we think about the most popular acts like Drake or Selena Gomez or Justin Bieber. Imagine if Justin Bieber died and we said, that's it, we can't call it pop music anymore. We need a new name because he was so important, so influential, we have to use a different name for music. That's what happened with Bach when he died. So when we say late Baroque, specifically we're going to be talking about from the year 1700 to 1750, and that's going to be the focus of this week. It's kind of interesting that Unit 3 in the textbook focuses on the 18th century, the 1700s, because the first half of the 1700s was Baroque, and the second half was classical. Now, I also want to clarify that term. Classical has many meanings in music, but we're going to talk about 2. Classical, for one, is an umbrella term for this variety of Western music that we're talking about. This entire class is devoted to classical music. So you can make the argument that medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, classical, Romantic, 20th century, these are all varieties of classical music. However, there's also a subsection of that which is also called classical. That's what we'll talk about in week 4. But I want you to think of baseball. Baseball is the name of the sport. It's also the name of the ball. When you're talking about baseball, the person you're speaking to, if they understand the sport at all, they've heard of it, they understand the context. Like, they can figure out what you're talking about. The same thing is true of classical music. Generally, once you get familiar with this material, you'll be able to differentiate when someone says classical, meaning all of classical music, or when they say classical, meaning the specific period that began in 1750. That's not what we're talking about this week, but that is part of Unit 3 in this textbook. Okay, so let's jump in. So we're specifically talking about 1700 to 1750. The textbook has 2 claims about the term Baroque. The first is that it originated within the art history community That part is not contested. That's absolutely true. The term Baroque first referred to artwork from this time period. Then it was later taken up by music scholars to refer to music from this period. The textbook also claims that the term refers to large irregularly shaped pearls. It does refer to those kind of pearls, but there's not a clear connection between jewelers using that term and music scholars using that term. That's contested. It's one theory, but it's not proven, so just take that part with a grain of salt. Okay, so it's really been very recently that Baroque music has become popular again. Within the last 100 years, within the last 75 years is what it claims in the textbook. So very, very recently have we rediscovered this music, rediscovered these instruments like the harpsichord, the recorder, yes, the recorder that you all probably played in elementary school. That is a version of the instrument we're talking about. A harpsichord looks like a piano. Someone who was not a trained musician would probably look at a harpsichord and think it's a very box angular piano. However, it is pretty different. A piano works by when you press the key, there's a hammer inside, and the hammer strikes some strings, and that's how you make sound. When you release the key, that hammer rests against the strings with a piece of felt, and it stops the sound. A harpsichord is almost like a clothespin in that it pinches the strings. So it's a much thinner sound. You can't control the volume. It's just an on or an off with the button. And the notes don't last very long. And the fact that the notes don't last very long when you play harpsichord compared to how long the notes can resonate on a piano or other instruments is why we have this ornamentation that we'll talk about a little bit later. If the sound can't carry on for a long time, you have to do something to fill the sound, otherwise you'll just have silence there. So the textbook identifies Bach and George Handel as the two most important figures in late Baroque. I think that's a fair claim for them to make. Both German-born, although Handel really has his greatest works are known from when he moved to London, England. So he's also thought of as an English composer. This was a time of absolutism in the age of science. So when we say absolutism, we're referring to this idea of absolute power for the monarchs. This worked its way into music in that these people were all powerful and they got whatever they want and they got the very best of whatever they want. So if you look at the picture of the Palace of Versailles by King Louis XIV of France, you see that that's just his home. That sort of over-the-top indulgence and beauty and just as much as you can do, gold everything. And he would have his own musicians for a variety of different jobs. Which we'll talk about in a moment, some of the different jobs of the musicians in this age of absolutism. However, we also have these breakthroughs in science, which are carrying over from the Renaissance. We have the inventions of the telescope and the microscope. Calculus is invented. We get laws of mechanics. The theory of gravity is developed at this time. We have philosophers such as Descartes and John Locke. And so these are all coming into play. So half of this is that the court, these kings who have extravagance in every facet of their lives want extravagant music as well, but also we have these scientific developments which are carrying their way into music as well. Okay, so at this point, just one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at that picture of Versailles, Paris was the capital of the world. Now this isn't an official title, but it was the most important city in the known world, at least in the Western world. France was devastated during World War II. And after World War II, New York City became the most important city of the Western world. However, at this point, it was certainly Paris. So just like before, I'm just going to kind of guide you through the text. I'm not going to point out every idea. I'm not even necessarily going to point out the most important ideas. I'm specifically focusing on ideas that I think you would most benefit from just having explained a little bit more, because some of the really important ideas are pretty clear just from the text. Okay, so let's talk about this absolutism again. So these are just a few of the different reasons why a king might hire musicians or a composer to compose music. If he's hunting, preparing for battle, for orchestras or for balls, like big fancy dances, entertainment, banquets, festivals, celebrations, military uses, to pay homage to kings and princes. So you get the idea that just any event that goes on, any elegant event, you want music there. So you're going to hire musicians and you're going to hire composers to compose music. And if you have the best of everything, you want the best music as well. The best composed music and the best musicians performing that music. One extension of this is Handel's Hallelujah Chorus, which is in the listening this week. A very famous piece. I'm sure all of you have heard it before. Many churches around the country perform this every Christmas. Your church may have performed it at some point. But if you hear how extravagant the music is, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords with the huge choir singing out together, think of that as one example of Baroque music. Also, remember that music was because it's all about extravagance, opera is going to be one of the most important genres because opera is this staged spectacle. So when it comes to Baroque music, in addition to Handel and Bach, I want you to think opera. Opera really hits its stride. It was developed in 1600, so opera's been around for 100 years now, starting in Italy and spreading across Europe. But by 1700, it really starts to become one of the most important styles in classical music. So with opera, the theater has the ability to do something that a regular orchestra performance can't do, and that is convey a story, specifically convey emotion. So this theme of emotion is going to come up throughout this chapter and throughout actually all these chapters associated with the reading for week 3. So think about opera and think about emotion. How can you infuse emotion into the play? How can you choose the actors and the music and the set and the stage and all of this? Again, this term spectacle keeps being used. How can you create heightened emotion? It's also at this point that certain philosophers and scientists and psychologists began to notice that there was this phenomenon that when you play certain kinds of music, people all have the same kind of emotional reaction. Certain songs make you feel a certain way, and a certain way emotionally. Certain chords even make you feel a certain way emotionally. A major chord makes you feel one way, a minor chord or a diminished chord makes you feel another way. And so they started to think about that. The composers began to think about that in terms of writing music based on emotion. How can we make the audience feel a certain way by writing music? This was always happening, but it wasn't so methodical up until this point in history. Another example of how scientific innovations affected music, we're now moving to this tempered system. So this is what we talk about under the science and music section. So this is actually a really complex idea musically that people who devote their lives and careers to music sometimes struggle to fully understand what's going on. So we're certainly not going to dive into that too deeply. It's outside of the scope of this class. However, I'll give you the short version. Each key is built on intervals. If you played notes in the key of C, they wouldn't necessarily work well in other keys. Like if I have a trumpet that's tuned to the key of C and I have the notes C, G, E, the way I would tune G, if the key is C, wouldn't necessarily sound good if the key was D. Those intervals are going to be off a little bit. So tempered music means that rather than having each song in one key and having instruments that are in one key, we're going to make every note off by just a little bit so that all the notes are equal. This makes it so that composers and orchestras and instruments, all facets of music, can play in all 12 chromatic keys. Again, it's a pretty complex idea, and the only thing that you have to remember is that when we say tempered or equal temperament, we're meaning that instruments can play in all the keys. That's the important part. The Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach is a famous example because he actually writes preludes and fugues in all 12 keys. A little bit of a lighting change, that's okay. Moving on through here. So let's focus just a little bit on musical life in the early 18th century. So this is the focus of this week. We're specifically talking about 1700 to 1750. So early 18th century, we have some people, Stradivarius. If you've heard of a Stradivarius violin, today there aren't many that survive, but they're still considered the best violins that have ever been created. If you want to purchase one, well, you can't really purchase one, but if you were to, it'd probably be about $2 million. Museums have them and they rent them out to orchestras. So for example, the Boston Museum might have one and they would rent it out to the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and their lead violin player gets to play it for the night. That's how rare they are, that's how expensive they are. That most people that use them are on loan from very prestigious museums. Chippendale in furniture, Paul Revere making silver, Benjamin Franklin was also famous for his inventions. That's starting to get into the latter half, but he was certainly doing that at this point in time as well. And this is important. Musicians were no different. Composers were no different. In the same way that Paul Revere's job was to make silver, to make a silver spoon, your job, if you're a composer, is to write songs, make songs. You are a craftsman. You are not an artist. Now, for those of you who move on and take history of rock, we're going to talk about this exact same idea happening in American music in the 20th century, something called the Brill building approach of the early 1960s, moving to something called the hippie aesthetic of the late 1960s. So that this theme is not unique to this point in history. It's something that comes up again and again throughout musical history, but as we're talking about it here, right now, we're in this craftsman approach. You make a song, and you make another song, and you keep generating these songs. Whereas when we get to the 1800s, the 19th century, it's going to be completely different. You're going to be focused on, you're an artist, and you want to make the best possible piece of music. You have this tortured soul that you put everything you have into a song. That'll come up in a few weeks. I think the book puts it really well when they say that these people were artisans with jobs rather than artists with a calling. So let's talk about some of these musical jobs. And there really are three. If you're a musician, if you're making a living as a musician during the late Baroque period in the 1700s, you have one of three jobs, almost certainly. You either work for the church, work for a local church, and the organists or the concert masters or the choir masters, they would compose their own music for worship, and they would lead the congregation, they would teach the choir, and that was their job. And sometimes they would write 2 songs a month, 1 song a week. It would definitely vary. But those were very coveted jobs. Each town or each city probably had one church, and if you wanted to be a professional musician, you basically had to become the worship leader, essentially, for that church. The other job, one of the other 2 jobs, was in the court, the king's court of local royalty. It wouldn't have to necessarily be a king, but it could be a duke or something like that. But your job was to have music for any of these things as they wanted. These events I listed earlier, for hunting or for military marches, or when distinguished guests would come to the castle, you would perform music for all of these. There is a clip I'm going to post this week, under week 3, from the movie Amadeus. It's about Mozart's life. Now that's the classical music, so that might be more appropriate for next week, but I posted it in week 3 because you get to see an example of one of these court musicians writing music, because Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, is coming to visit the king, and they had the court composer write a song for his entrance. And so that's the only purpose of that song, and probably never be performed again after that. The final job would be in an opera house. So either the composer who is writing the operas, if you're really lucky, or one of the musicians in the orchestra pit. And this is something that's still true today. One of the best jobs, if you're a musician, if you're a great musician, it's playing as the pit orchestra member for musical theater. The highest level would, of course, be Broadway, but many of America's largest cities, New York, Boston, San Diego, Los Angeles, Chicago, they have professional theater companies, and they have the highest level of musicians playing in those pit orchestras, because you need now and then to be able to look at a piece of music and play it perfectly on the first try. Back then, if you had an opera, the composer would almost certainly be the one who would conduct that opera, and it would run for however long it would run, and then it probably would never be performed again, at least at the time. Of course, they've been revived since then, but initially, if you wanted to revive a story, it was considered poor practice to just redo someone else's opera. A composer would write a new opera to that Greek story or whatever it might be. Like, if I wanted to do Orfeo, I wouldn't use the Orfeo we listened to last week. I would write my own new version of Orfeo. And the singers expected that too. They wanted new music to sing to. They just didn't want to sing something that someone else had already done. So those are your 3 jobs. You either work for a church, you worked for the court of some type of monarch, or you worked in an opera house. If you don't have one of those three jobs, you're probably not a professional musician making a living and supporting a family with music. It might be a hobby. In fact, it was a hobby for many people, just like many people play guitar today, but not many people are professional musicians today. The same was true back then. What's interesting is Bach was a church musician and Handel was a court musician, so we get two of those. And there are some really interesting biographies that we'll look at very briefly together, but I encourage you to read through those very carefully later in the chapter. Some style features of late Baroque music. Now there are a lot of really great descriptions on here for rhythm, dynamics, the Baroque orchestra, melody, things like that. We're not going to talk about all of them, but we are going to talk about a few. The first one is rhythm. This is something that began to become true in the Renaissance, but now we've finally arrived. It's that we have a clear beat. If you listen to music from the Baroque period, you're going to be able to tap along with wherever the beat is. Dynamics are a little bit different. So dynamics refer to volume, which you should remember from week 1, Fundamentals of Music. However, it wasn't always written in. It was expected that the musician would play these dynamics, that you would be expressive in how you played, but it wouldn't tell you in the music, be loud here, be soft here, be kind of loud here, slowly get quieter here. None of that was really in the music. It started to be written in, but it was mostly dramatic changes. Quiet, 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 loud, all of a sudden. And they would write an F in there, F standing for forte, or a P in there, P standing for piano. Forte means loud, piano means quiet. We see some examples of music in here. You can see that sheet music, and even if you're not a musician, I think you can probably tell just by looking at it, it's pretty busy, it's very fast, there are a lot of notes going on. Ornamentation. So ornamentation is something that we spoke about a little bit earlier, but ornamentation is, again, it comes back to this idea that the harpsichord did not have very much sustain. You'd play a note, and the note would kind of stop very quickly after you played it. So you might play very quick little fills in there, and you can listen to music and you'll hear these very quick little flourishes in the music. If you look at the sheet music for these songs, sometimes they're written in, but usually they aren't. And a person who specializes in Baroque music knows that when you see a long note, like a half note, you're going to do a trill, or you're going to throw in some extra notes around that note just to keep it interesting, because one, ornamentation, it goes back to this idea of absolutism, absolute power for the monarch. Everything has to be extravagant and over the top, but also the instruments kind of require it because their sound doesn't last for very long. Another example that the book gives, which I think is really helpful for ornamentation, is the Star Spangled Banner. The standard version of the Star Spangled Banner is very straight. There's usually one note for every word. However, if you listen to anyone's Super Bowl rendition, you'll hear that they throw in lots of extra notes. Those are examples of ornamentation. Sometimes ornamentation can be a good thing. It can really add to and enhance a song, and sometimes ornamentation can borderline ruin a song, and that'll be up to you to make those choices. Talking about the texture, by this point, it's pretty much, you can assume that everything is pretty much polyphonic, unless it's a featured soloist. But if it's a whole group of musicians playing together, it's going to be polyphonic at this point. We have the continuo is still used, the basso continuo. We're starting to see something called figured bass, which is a number system that I wouldn't say it's still used today. It is taught in music theory classes around the country and around the world, but it's mostly taught because it was so prevalently used at this point. But there are certain numbers, like 164 means that you play a certain chord a certain way. Like 1164 in C, you would play G, C, E. It's just looking at a number, a Roman numeral number, and then an Arabic number, and knowing how you're supposed to play a chord. Again, not something you have to remember for this, but it is interesting. So now we get on to more of this idea of the emotional aspects of Baroque music. The authors of the textbook argue that even today's listeners can listen to Baroque music and feel that emotional power that's behind the music. I'd be very interested to hear if any of you felt that way upon listening to it for the first time. Going on to some instrumental music of the Baroque period. So we get a new genre or new style called a concerto, also called a concerto grosso. So concerto just means that you have, it's almost like an orchestra is the backup band or the accompaniment for one instrument. So a violin concerto would have a featured violinist and then a whole orchestra accompanying that person, or a featured bassoon or a featured lute and then a whole orchestra accompanying that person. We have the introduction of movements. So a movement is when you take one piece of music and you break it into smaller sections. You would say smaller movements. And there's always something a little bit different about each movement. Maybe the speed is different, maybe the mood is different, or the key, or one's major, the other is minor, but there's something distinct about them. And you'll hear the term movement used in songs a lot. So for example, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the fourth movement is the Ode to Joy. When we get to romantic music, you'll of course have the opportunity to hear that, but an individual movement of a larger piece can almost be thought of as its own individual piece of music. So the definition they use is a movement is a self-contained section of music that is part of a larger work. Movements can be compared to chapters in a book, and they will always show some variety in tempo, meter, key, musical form, or mood. I think that's an excellent definition. We have the ritornello form. This is very similar to a rondo. So ritornello or rondo, one of the ways that I had it explained to me, and it's a little silly, but I think it makes it easy to remember. So here is the definition, or one way to think about it. So I have a pet velociraptor, and his name is Rondo, and we were at home together. Rondo ran away. He ran to the grocery store. So I went and I got him and I brought him home. But then Rondo ran away again, and this time he ran to the park. So I went and got him, I brought him home. But then he ran away again, and this time he went to the high school down the street. And so I went and got Rondo, and then I brought him back. And then he ran away again, this time went to the ice cream store. So the idea is that you start with one place, the home, and then you keep going to different places, but you always come back home in between. Those are different sections of music. You have your home section, the foundation of a song, and then you go play something else. But then you come back and you play the first part again. And then you go play something new, and then you come back and play the first part again. Rondo or a ritornello, very similar. One thing that's very interesting, this is almost a side note, but I think it's worth pointing out, is the role that women began to play in music at this time. Vivaldi, the composer who did the Four Seasons, Spring being one of them, those are 4 movements, by the way. Each movement is a different season. He was the music teacher at a girls' orphanage, and a lot of his music was premiered by girls who were orphans at this orphanage. This is noteworthy for 2 reasons. At this point, not many women played musical instruments. I mean, many did from wealthier families who could afford to have their young daughters take harpsichord lessons or harp lessons. Perhaps if your father was a musician, maybe he taught you how to play, but not many young girls were learning to play instruments. And like I said, it was usually associated with the wealthier classes. So the fact that a lot of Vivaldi's music was premiered by girls who were orphans, so very low class in terms of the class status, that's pretty remarkable when you think about that. So as you're listening to Vivaldi, remember that a lot of this music was originally performed by orphan girls. Going through here, Vivaldi, who I just spoke about, was a priest, which is very interesting, and we have his bio here. One thing that I do want to point out is that Bach, when he was very young, learned a lot of Vivaldi's pieces. He would sit there and he would copy them out, and that's sort of how he learned to write concertos, was from Vivaldi. We see this in modern music as well. For example, Eddie Van Halen learned from Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton learned from a guitarist named Robert Johnson. So even though they're not actually related, I think of it as like generational learning, that one person learned from another person who learned from another person. Beethoven and Mozart learned from Bach. Bach learned from Vivaldi. So we start to see these ideas carried forth. We have a picture of a harpsichord. Very ornate. Again, think of that with Baroque style, that even the paintings have to be ornate. Fugues. Okay, so now we have our Bach biography. So again, he was German. He was actually thrown in jail because he tried to take a different job. When you're working as a court musician, you don't take another job, or at least you can be thrown in jail if you try to. So he spent a few weeks in jail. He went blind very late in his life, and a lot of people think of Beethoven as going deaf, which he did, but not everyone thinks of Bach going blind. One of the most important things to think about Bach is he was actually, by the end of his life, 1750s when he passed, he was considered almost irrelevant and passé. He was like old school music, and he wasn't really respected in the music industry anymore. A lot of composers really did appreciate his music, like I mentioned, Beethoven and Mozart, but to the general public, he wasn't really considered a big deal anymore. And it was only hundreds of years later, when his music was rediscovered, that we really started to have this appreciation for Bach, and he became one of the three most important classical music composers. But in his own lifetime, he certainly didn't experience that. And when we think of a sort of a rock star, this musician leading this crazy life, that idea kind of starts with Mozart and Beethoven as well. So he didn't even have a life of extravagance. He was essentially a worship leader. He led the concert, he taught music at his church, he played the music, he conducted it. That's why he wrote so many pieces. They were all for his church. He died having lost a lot of his fame and being considered out of date, which is sad to think of, but at least he's remembered now. Baroque dance forms. Binary is one of the important ones. So we talked about binary a little bit in the fundamentals of music education, fundamentals of music video. Now moving into this final portion of this week, which is Baroque vocal music. Again, when you think of Baroque vocal music, I want you to think of opera, and I want you to think of just packed with emotion. And again, opera can convey emotion in a way that other music can't. For one, you have lyrics, so you can actually tell a story, but you have these elaborate costumes and stages and sets and set pieces and this full orchestra and just the heightened emotion of a live performance. So by 1700, like I said, opera was 100 years old, and the Italian opera, specifically Italian opera, had spread throughout Europe. And in many countries, they would actually continue to write their operas in Italian, even if they were in England. Rather than writing in English, or in Germany, rather than writing in German, or in French, they would still write in Italian. That's why our modern music uses Italian terms for everything. We have forte, piano, crescendo, decrescendo, diminuendo. All of these terms are Italian because Italian operas were the most popular at this point. So this is something that does go back a very long time, about 300 years. Castrati, the castrato. So a castrato, or castrati is the plural, is a type of singer who is a grown man who, when he, right before he hit puberty, he was castrated. He had his testicles cut off, and he never experienced puberty, and he never had his voice deepen as his vocal folds would have expanded. And so they are grown men who have incredibly high, almost angelic voices, as the textbook points out, almost sounding sweeter than the best soprano. This was mostly only done in Italy. Other countries in Europe thought it was crazy that they would do this to people. But Italy wasn't the only country in the world. Eunuchs, it's called a eunuch, is a person who's been castrated. They were throughout China and Southeast Asia and other countries, not for their vocal quality though, but because if they were going to be like serving in the king's court, they wouldn't want, through some reason or some way, maybe someone royal being impregnated by someone who wasn't royal. So all the men that would work around them had been castrated. So just to make sure that can't happen, they're also, they don't have the testosterone, so not quite as driven in some other ways. I'm sure you can use your imagination to figure out exactly what we're talking about there. But anyway, castrati were considered the pinnacle singer, the best voices, the lead roles in all the operas were almost always given to castrato males. This is something that, again, it seems strange to us, but if we think back to music of the 20th century, a lot of the most successful pop acts had really, really high male singers. And we have people like Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin who were really high, but they were screaming. But we also have really high, more gentle, sweet sounds like the Beach Boys, the Four Seasons, and many artists from Motown. The aria is still going strong by this point. We also have the oratorio. So the oratorio is basically an opera, but with two significant differences. For one, it's sacred. It is not secular. It's either telling the life of a biblical figure or a saint, something like that. But because it's sacred, there's a greater reverence, so they don't use costumes, they don't use props or sets or anything. It's still a performance, but you just, they would stand there and they would perform the music. So that's an oratorio. When you think of Handel, the most important piece should be the Messiah. This is the piece that Hallelujah, the Hallelujahs chorus, comes from. So George Friedrich Handel's original name was Georg, which is the German variation, but as he moved from Germany to London, he anglicized his name and went by George after that. He was a pretty interesting character. He was in a duel, as in where you have a disagreement with another person, and you each pick up a pistol and you walk 10 paces away from each other and turn around and shoot, and the person who's alive is the winner. He had a duel, and clearly he survived. He was a court musician, both in Germany and in London, and he was trained in law, so he was trained to be a lawyer and then became a musician. So as you're listening to the Messiah, use that and use any of the pieces by Bach. The Fugue in D minor is a great one, the Well-Tempered Clavier, the Brandenburg Concertos. Use any of those as your primary examples of Baroque music. So late Baroque, also early 18th century. Okay, so that is where we will end this today. Again, any questions, let me know. You have your discussion board post due this week. So best of luck on that. And any questions, I'm here for you. Have a great week.